Welcome, my dears, to part 5 of the recap of the Manhwa Kill the Villainess. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, you can find it on the channel or through the link in the description and the pinned comment. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Lady Miserian took her fiancé by the arm, reminding him to smile, as the Emperor had ordered him to take good care of her. The prince, in turn, reminded her of the boundaries long crossed thanks to the Emperor's affection for her. Alice suggested he submit a petition, attempt to annul his marriage with such a cruel and harmful woman, and flee to the sweet and gentle Entobloom, unless of course his plan was to force his fiancée to kneel beside him and beg for it. Her words left the young man stunned. After all, he could not utter a single word in his father's presence, and thus vented all his anger on her. Their quarrel was interrupted by a maid holding an umbrella, who reminded them of the upcoming knighting ceremony. Lady Miserian, under the pretense of not wanting to be late, dragged Alecto along with her. Angrily, he reminded her that the Emperor's favor toward her would not last forever, and she was rapidly draining the last drops of his goodwill. Alice, with a smirk, retorted, asking whether he had any goodwill at all, as she herself had long run out of it. Sunlight streamed through the palace windows, where the crowd had already gathered, strolling about and admiring the knights. The opening ceremony had only just concluded, but Lady Miserian already felt nauseated. She rose from her seat, deciding to leave. She opted to circle around the palace, trying to ease the tormenting sensation from the corset, squeezing her organs and rearranging everything inside her before her meeting with the imperial family. She hoped to find a quiet spot to rest, but suddenly heard a commotion nearby, in the bushes behind the trees. Someone was chattering and hitting something. Alice headed in that direction to investigate what was going on. A group of young men was violently beating and kicking something, or, more precisely, someone, underneath a white tablecloth. They called him a weakling and an idiot, provoking him and demanding that he stand. From their conversation, it seemed they had decided to put the illegitimate child in his place, a boy who, apparently, aspired to become a knight. After all, in this world, there were only two ways to achieve any status: become either a knight or a magical engineer. In the novel Alice had read, Helena also escaped false accusations and married the crown prince only after regaining her aristocratic status. Alice's attention shifted back to the beaten boy. Judging by the fabric on him, likely chosen to avoid leaving marks and arousing suspicion, the bullying had been going on for quite some time. Even if she showed mercy and helped the poor boy, it wouldn't save him. In fact, it might make things worse by emboldening the bullies to commit even crueler acts. And even if there was a solution, she didn't feel particularly inclined to deal with it. Suddenly, the leader of the group ordered the boy to be lifted. They grabbed him by the collar of his uniform and yanked away the fabric, and at the sight before her, Alice's green eyes widened. The battered boy turned out to be the brother of the little girl who had saved her from pursuit a few days ago. Suddenly, his eyes darted toward her, and judging by his expression, he recognized her. Now the question of whether a noblewoman should intervene to help this particular illegitimate child became far more pressing. She nervously fidgeted with her dress, weighing whether her interference was justified. Would it be seen as cheap pity from an aristocrat, or worse, condescension? After all, just 2 days ago, she had threatened that, by her will, they would be gone within 6 hours, and any words they spoke would be dismissed as baseless rumors. It would look highly suspicious if the woman who had blackmailed him suddenly emerged from the shadows to rescue him from torment. It would be the most blatant of deceptions. Sometimes doing an unwanted good deed could result in greater harm. In this case, it would only embarrass him further. The boy didn't take his light-colored eyes off her, silently waiting for her next move, but she turned away, justifying her decision by reminding herself that her agreement had been with the little girl, not her brother. She glanced back at him one last time over her shoulder as he watched the departing lady with his eyes. She returned to the palace once again, and at the ongoing knighting ceremony, rows of young men in uniform stood in perfect alignment, ready to serve their masters. This tradition was an excellent opportunity for aristocrats seeking to elevate their status. They only needed to recruit knights from the highest nobility. Many guests had already made arrangements with knights beforehand and were anxious, fearing their choices might be claimed earlier in the selection order. Since Lady Miserian had no intention of hiring a knight, she repeatedly passed on her turn, but her attention was drawn to the distant row. For the most part, It was filled with older men compared to the young men standing at the front. A guard leaned toward her and explained that those were the ones who hadn't been chosen previously. Alice inquired about what happened to them if they remained unchosen, and the man elaborated. Initially, the aristocrats assume it's just bad luck, but as time goes on, guests begin to suspect there's a reason for it and avoid choosing them altogether. The older they get, the weaker they're perceived to be, and if they remain unselected for 10 years, they give up and become mercenaries. Among the older men stood out the battered boy she had encountered earlier outside the palace. Lady Miserian asked if there was any demand for mercenaries, and the reply was that people preferred clean and well-groomed knights. Even serving a poor family would pay better than being a mercenary. Moreover, knights had the right to marry their master's daughter to improve their status or strike a deal with a noble family. However, such a future would be a tremendous shock for an aristocrat, as losing their sense of dignity was considered far worse than death itself. The guard standing behind hesitated, but then admitted that the last time he dared to speak of his dreams, he was immediately accused of impropriety. Lady Miserian simply told him not to dwell on the past, to which the man let out a relieved sigh and bowed in gratitude for her graciousness. But then he brought up a topic she had already heard endlessly. Setting aside any possible reasons to fear this decision, he fervently urged her to choose and hire her own knight. Alice shifted her gaze to the guard, who knelt before her on one knee, saying that her choice could save the life of the one she selected. After all, she could release him from her service at any time if she wished, and it would already be easier for him to be chosen again or find another job. At her raised eyebrow of skepticism, he added that their entire lives had been devoted to training to become knights. It would be a great tragedy if their fire extinguished without ever having the chance to blaze brightly. When Lady Miserian remarked that his words sounded like a plea for mercy, the guard did not deny it, and instead asked her to listen. She truly began to consider it. Though becoming a savior might bolster her status, it would also place an additional burden of responsibility on her shoulders, a far cry from taming a small animal. But she made her decision. Alice raised her hand and pointed her finger at the battered boy in the second-to-last row, declaring that she wanted to take him into her service. The lady's piercing gaze bore into the stunned young man, who froze for a moment, staring back at her in astonishment. However, within a few seconds, he bent his knee before her as a servant brought the sword for the ritual. Lady Miserian asked about his loyalty and devotion to her, demanding an oath before the face of God, much like in the knighthood initiation ceremony, and the boy obediently swore that he would follow her, even if the road ahead were filled with poverty and hardship. He raised his head and spoke the final words, gazing directly into her eyes that no temptations would sway him from his true path. The girl gave a faint nod, her expression unchanged, and touched the blade of the sword to his shoulder, contemplating that this didn't feel like saving him. She was sure that in a few years, he would surely have the chance for a better life. Yet after what had transpired, this was a debt repaid to the boy for a small and insignificant kindness that the ordinary nobility would have ignored. His own boots for her when she had no shoes. But now she had repaid him in full. Alice asked for his name, but the new knight, lowering his eyes in shame, confessed that he had no name. Lady Miserian pondered, trying to come up with something. Studying her new knight and placing her hand on his head and lifting it slightly, decided that he would be called Anakin. Looking into his eyes, she remembered a moment from a novel she had read. Lady Miserian, despised by all, had one person who stood by her until the very end, her own Black Knight, who now stood before the reader. The Crown Prince's fiancée could not leave such an important event without bidding farewell to the imperial family. Despite her overwhelming desire to leave the knighting ceremony and return home, she approached the Emperor and Empress, greeting them respectfully, and it seemed that only Alec's father was genuinely pleased to see Alice. He complimented her appearance, especially her purple dress, to which the girl thanked the palace for the beautiful attire. The Emperor noted that, contrary to her earlier decision not to hire a knight, she had changed her mind, and Alice explained that everyone had strongly urged her to do so, and she had no reason to oppose them. The Emperor approved of her choice, though his wife and son were less pleased with her presence. Lady Miserian glanced at her fiancé, hinting that he should speak up about wanting to break off the marriage arrangement, but he merely turned away, bringing a glass of red wine to his lips, ignoring her. Forcing herself not to roll her eyes, Alice bowed and asked for permission to leave the event due to the pain in her body and exhaustion from having woken up at dawn, receiving immediate approval from the Emperor. Thanking him for his concern, Miserian exited the palace. deciding that the first thing she would do upon sitting in the carriage was take off her shoes before her feet completely gave out. Suddenly she heard a familiar voice. In the gazebo stood Iason, who was passionately asking Helena for something. A scene flashed in the reader's mind. In this chapter, the knighthood ceremony played almost no role compared to what happened after it. Iason's oath of loyalty to Helena in order to become her knight. Helena naively reminded Kajaru that such an oath could only be given once, and asked why he wanted to offer it to her specifically, not realizing that her words were the answer. The boy drew his sword, kneeling and bowing his head, and recited the oath that Alice herself had recently received. He offered her the blade to complete the ritual with the final words of his readiness to follow her, even along a path of poverty and hardship. Entablam grew anxious, but Iason firmly insisted that he wanted to protect her until the end, begging her to allow him to do so. The strong dragon slayer held the sword before the delicate girl, ready to become her knight, and a small hand gently stroked the boy's red hair. An ideal love scene would have unfolded before Alice, if she hadn't known about the prince observing the picture, who was visibly tense, unable to believe that his best friend had sworn an oath of loyalty to his beloved. No friend would dare such a thing for an ordinary childhood companion, unless of course he preferred a ring to a sword, but naturally Helen didn't understand this, and the young woman decided to step in. She stepped into the gazebo, drawing the couple's attention, and apologized to Mr. Kajar in case she had interrupted them. At her polite question about whether she had interrupted anything, Jason hesitantly replied that nothing had happened. Lady Miserian turned to Helen, saying that the Empress had been looking for her, which made Helen panic, and after thanking Alice and hastily saying goodbye to Kajar, she rushed out of the gazebo, heading towards the palace. The prince followed her, replacing the dull love triangle scene depicted in the book. Now Lady Miserian was left alone with Sir Kajar, and turned to him, drawing his attention. She gave him a small piece of advice, suggesting that he should at least look around from time to time, but he stupidly smiled, asking what she meant. Suddenly, a memory flashed through Alice's mind. He was a master of the sword, which meant he was aware of both her and Electo's presence. The knight's expression grew more serious. He couldn't help but notice the foreign energy, yet he still proceeded with his intentions. Jason adjusted a strand of the woman's hair, saying that she was making a surprised face. Irritated, the girl swatted his hand away from her hair, and the young man calmly continued, reminding her of his request not to be upset with them, but noting that she hadn't fully understood his words. This wasn't friendly advice, it was a warning, and now Mr. Kajar spoke of it directly. It seemed he believed that Alice had been slapped for tormenting Helen, and if we recall the original book, it was justified. She had always taunted her rival, so he could very well hate Lady Miserian. Perhaps, if he had killed her earlier, everyone would have been much happier, and dragging it out was becoming tedious. That was why the girl suggested Jason finish it right now, since he held a sword in his hands. For a swordmaster, it would be no trouble to slice her apart. The young man was taken aback, and Lady Miserian quickly moved toward him, then suddenly reached for the blade, which at that moment clinked against the stone floor of the gazebo. Now he held her firmly by the wrists, not allowing her to move them, and Alice whispered that if he made such warnings, he should also be ready to kill an opponent. His eyes pierced through her, and the question that had recently been voiced by Hybris escaped his lips. Who the hell is she? Alice walked past him, asking again what sudden foolishness he had just said. After all, he had never cared about Lady Miserian. The carriage with Alice and her new knight pulled away from the palace, and the girl pondered that she knew no more about the Black Knight than Jason knew about her. In the novel, his name was never revealed, perhaps because he always stayed in the shadows. There was no mention of his appearance either. The only thing known for sure was that he was Alice's only companion, and the one who could love her. However, in this world, he had met a reader, not a real character from the story, so perhaps he wouldn't fall in love if it wasn't her. Then there was the possibility of betrayal that couldn't be ignored. All these thoughts made her head ache when Anakin suddenly asked a question. Why had she chosen him? Lady Miserian asked if he preferred another master, to which he replied that he had no right to choose. Unlike her, the daughter of the Marquis Miserian and fiancée of the prince, who couldn't choose an illegitimate, nameless boy from a sea of knights from noble families without some ulterior motive. The girl looked at Anakin, unable to imagine how he could fall in love with Alice. She waved her hand, saying that he could forget all the nonsense the knights of her family had filled his head with during her absence. She had no doubt they had spun tales about kindness and salvation, but that wasn't the truth. Her reason lay in the Marquess's words about how her knight would do what must be kept secret, silence about all her secrets. And most importantly, as Alice had stated, he would have to die for her. Anakin looked at his mistress, seemingly realizing what she had just said. While he helped his lady out of the carriage, the girl thought that, since she knew her knight's weakness, he wouldn't resist her, and the guarantee that she wouldn't lose control over him was what made her choose him as her champion. Once in her chambers, the lady finally stretched her legs out on the bed after a long day, but her attention was drawn to the small mirror by her pillow, in which, instead of her reflection, she saw familiar sapphire eyes and red hair. Startled, she screamed and jumped out of bed, and at her cry a maid rushed in, asking what had happened. Her mistress quickly came up with an explanation, saying a bug must have flown into the room, and dismissed Emma, assuring her there was nothing to worry about. As soon as the door slammed shut, Alice muttered venomously, wondering why she had been frightened like that, to which the witch retorted sarcastically about how busy she was. The stranger had completely forgotten her request to carry the mirror with her. Getting to the point and asking for the news, Medea conveyed the words from her sisters, saying that a person cannot break the laws of causality with their body. Such a thing requires a corresponding price, and the life of an ordinary person is insignificant for that. At the very least, it must be paid for with the heart of a dragon, the mother of nature, which is impossible for a young woman. This was something the reader understood as well, recalling Jason's words. The witch clarified what the high priest had said in response to Alice's question, and she relayed his statement that it would only be possible if the soul remained in its original body, but it was most likely now just an empty shell, making a return unrealistic. But then Medea conspiratorially winked, offering something else, an option where it would be possible to leave the world without breaking its laws. The witch explained that the law of cause and effect itself is a rule according to which a living being must complete its mission, a mission that was originally prescribed by this world. It is the same principle by which heroes arise in troubled times. Some are born to save the world, while others live and die to give another a reason to do so. A precise mechanism in which, if one part breaks, the entire world collapses. Its preservation depends on this law, and a tremendous price must be paid for its violation. In response to the stranger's question about what awaits those who fulfill their task, Medea answered that they die, but with official permission to do so, for before completing their mission, death is simply impossible for them. The reader knew Alice's purpose perfectly well, to kill Helena for the sake of revenge. Medea asked if the stranger knew the reason for Lady Miserian's existence in this world, and the girl remembered that after Entabol's death, she would already be sentenced to execution, meaning she herself had to move toward her own death. She asked how the witch could help her without violating the law of causality, and Medea replied that after death, the soul is reborn in the same world, and after Alice's death, the reader would be reincarnated here according to the rules of this world. Only witches can break laws and rules, but for that, several sacrifices will be required to return the stranger to her true home. At once, the anxious question came, what sacrifices would have to be made? To which Medea squinted mysteriously, inspecting her client, and carelessly, with a laugh, she said that she hadn't yet learned all the details. Alice gloomily flopped onto the bed after the foolish joke, while Medea tried to cheer her up, assuring her that she and her sisters would soon clarify all the details of the matter. But this didn't offer much reassurance to the stranger, considering Hybris's words that no one had ever left this world alive, and that even witches struggled to find a solution. As she started to wonder if the reward was too little, the girl from the mirror assured her that the payment would be taken later. After all, she had drunk the contract at their first meeting. At first, Alice didn't understand what she meant, but then she remembered the mysterious drink she had drunk from the bowl. Medea advised her not to put everything into her mouth that strangers offer, before the girl, in a fit of rage, jumped up and declared that it was unfair since she hadn't known its contents. However, the witch declared that it was all fair. After all, now they held each other's lives in their hands. She promised to contact her client as soon as something was known, and reminded her to carry this means of communication with her, also warning that if she got into serious trouble, she should find the largest mirror. After that, her image disappeared. After such a flood of information, Alice felt completely drained, and a thought flashed through her mind that she hadn't seen her new knight since arriving at the estate. Had they given him a proper room? In a half-sleep, the girl whispered his name, and the door immediately opened, admitting Anakin, who startled his mistress. She was surprised that he could hear her and immediately became worried if he now knew about her conversation with Medea. Her ladyship allowed the young man to enter her room, and he knelt before her at the bed, declaring one of the knight's main moral principles, to never reveal his master's secrets. This confirmed her suspicions that he had heard everything, and such a sharp ear could only belong to two types of people in this world. Since he was not a magical engineer, the girl decided to ask him if he was a sword master, to which she received a foolish and ambiguous answer. She clarified how, to a question that could only have a yes or no answer, he could say almost. And Anakin explained that he could read signs of presence, but could not unlock the energy of a sword, which excluded the possibility of him being a sword master. Lady Miserian frowned, returning to the fact that he had heard everything, and asked the semi-master what he thought about it. In her mind, thoughts were already forming on how to deal with him if he decided to accuse Alice of being involved with the witch, slander him as a liar, or kill him right away. However, the knight chose to clarify if he understood correctly that his mistress was not from this world. As much as Alice didn't want to admit it, since she had decided to treat him as her confidant, there was no other choice. She acknowledged this, approaching the window in her room, but clarified that it was not Lady Miserian, but the soul in her body, the foreigner. Anakin, asking if she wanted to return and receiving an affirmative answer, made it clear that he was ready to help her. The girl furrowed her brows slightly, turning to the knight, not understanding his calmness after such a confession that his mistress was from another world, and moreover, a criminal who had violated the prohibition on contact with witches. From her skeptical glance, Anakin understood that she suspected him of thinking she was crazy for not considering her insane after all the nonsense he had heard, but he assured her that, after living in the narrow alleys where every third person points at the world and accuses it of madness, it's impossible to distinguish what has truly gone mad and what hasn't. One could say that's what makes life more interesting, for that is exactly what it is. With such logic, one can't enjoy it without being labeled as crazy by someone's opinion. After these words, Alice even began to doubt if he was truly human, and she hurriedly approached him, placing her hand on his warm cheek, confirming that he was alive. Unperturbed, Anakin continued, saying that he didn't care who she was because it wouldn't change his duties or his oath. Lady Miserian asked what she needed to do, and the knight replied that she needed to command, and he would obey and carry out her orders without question. Alice returned to her bed. She had heard everything she needed to be sure that such a person wouldn't break his duties because of deep feelings. Even if they were to manifest toward Helena, his loyalty would remain with his mistress. The knight tensed, wondering if she was disappointed by his confession that, in his own way, he had also gone mad. But the girl smiled at him and said that, on the contrary, she liked it very much. The next day also began in this world with its silly laws, but today would be different from the rest. Accompanied by her knight, Lady Miserian warned that she was heading to Lauter, the largest confectionery in the entire country. She had dressed like a commoner on purpose to avoid drawing unnecessary attention to her person. Inside, she met her little savior, who, as it turned out, had been very eager to see Alice. It turned out that she had finally learned where the priest, whom the girl had sent to search for, was living, and finally, she had been able to catch his trail.